Chapter 1. The Ship from Terra. I went through the gateway, towing my equipment in a contragravity hamper over my head. As usual, I was wondering what it would take, short of a revolution, to get the city of Port Sandor as clean and tidy and well-lighted as the spaceport area. I knew Dad's editorials and my sarcastic news stories wouldn't do it. We'd been trying long enough. The two girls in bikinis in front of me pushed on, still gabbling about the fight one of them had had with her boyfriend, and I closed up behind the half-dozen monster hunters in long trousers, ankle boots, and short boat jackets, with big knives on their belts. They must have all been from the same crew, because they weren't arguing about whose ship was fastest, had the toughest skipper, and made the most money. They were talking about the price of tallow wax, and they seemed to have picked up a rumor that it was going to be cut another 10 centisols a pound. I eavesdropped shamelessly, but it was the same rumor I'd picked up myself a little earlier. "Hi, Walt," somebody behind me called out. "Looking for some news that's fit to print?" I turned my head. It was a man of about 35 with curly brown hair and a wide grin. Adolphe Lautier, the entertainment promoter. He and Dad each owned a share in the Port Sandor telecast station and split their time between his music and drama films and Dad's newscasts. "All the news is fit to print, and if it's news, the Times prints it," I told him. "Think you're going to get some good thrillers this time?" He shrugged. I just asked that to make conversation. He never had any way of knowing what sort of films would come in. The ones the Peeneminda was bringing should be fairly new, because she was outbound from Terra. He'd go over what was aboard, and trade one for the old films he'd shown already. "They tell me there's a real old Terran-style Western been showing on Volan that ought to be coming our way this time," he said. "It was filmed in South America, with real horses." That would go over big here. Almost everybody thought horses were as extinct as dinosaurs. I've seen so-called westerns, with the cowboys riding Freyan Okri. I mentioned that, and then added, "They'll think the old cattle towns like Dodge and Abilene were awful sissy places, though." "I suppose they were, compared to Port Sandor," Lautier said. "Are you going aboard to interview the distinguished visitor?" "Which one?" I asked. "Glenn Morrell or Leo Belcher?" Lautier called Leo Belcher something you won't find in the dictionary, but which nobody needs to look up. The hunters, ahead of us, heard him and laughed. They couldn't possibly have agreed more. He was going to continue with the fascinating subject of Mr. Leo Belcher's ancestry and personal characteristics, and then bit it off short. I followed his eyes and saw old Professor Hartzenbosch, the principal of the school, approaching. "Oh, here you are, Mr. Lautier," he greeted. "I trust that I did not keep you waiting." Then he saw me. "Why, it's Walter Boyd. How's your father, Walter?" I assured him as to Dad's health, and inquired about his own, and then asked him how things were going at school. As well as could be expected, he told me, and I gathered that he kept his point of expectation safely low. Then he wanted to know if I were going aboard to interview Mr. Morrell. "Really, Walter, it is a wonderful thing that a famous author like Mr. Morrell should come here to write a book about our planet," he told me, very seriously, and added, as an afterthought, "Have you any idea where he intends staying while he is among us?" "Why, yes," I admitted. "After the Peeneminda radioed us their passenger list, Dad talked to him by screen and invited him to stay with us. Mr. Morrell accepted, at least until he can find quarters of his own. There are a lot of good poker players in Port Sandor, but Professor Jan Hartzenbosch is not one of them." The look of disappointment would have been comical if it hadn't been so utterly pathetic. He'd been hoping to lasso Morrell himself.
"I wonder if Mr. Morrell could spare time to come to the school and speak to the students," he said after a moment.
"I'm sure he could. I'll mention it to him, Professor," I promised. Professor Hartzenbosch bridled at that. The great author ought to be coming to his school out of respect for him, not because a 17-year-old cub reporter sent him. But then Professor Hartzenbosch always took the attitude that he was conferring a favor on the Times when he had anything he wanted publicity on. The elevator door opened, and Lautier and the professor joined in the push to get into it. I hung back, deciding to wait for the next one so that I could get in first and get back to the rear, where my hamper wouldn't be in people's way. After a while, it came back empty, and I got on. And when the crowd pushed off on the top level, I put my hamper back on contragravity and towed it out into the outdoor air, which by this time had gotten almost as cool as a bake-oven. I looked up at the sky, where everybody else was looking. The Peenemünde wasn't visible. It was still a few thousand miles off-planet. Big, ragged clouds were still blowing in from the west, very high, and the sunset was even brighter and redder than when I had seen it last, 10 hours before. It was now about 16:30. Now, before anybody starts asking just who's crazy, let me point out that this is not on Terra, nor on Balder, nor Thor, nor Odin, nor Freya, nor any other rational planet. This is Fenris, and on Fenris the sunsets, like many other things, are somewhat peculiar. Fenris is the second planet of a G4 star, 650 light-years to the galactic southwest of the Sol system. Everything else equal, it should have been pretty much Terra type, closer to a cooler primary and getting about the same amount of radiation. At least, that's what the book says. I was born on Fenris, and have never been off it in the 17 years since. Everything else, however, is not equal. The Fenris year is a trifle shorter than the Terran year we use for atomic-era dating, 8,000 and a few odd galactic standard hours. In that time, Fenris makes almost exactly 4 axial rotations. This means that on one side the sun is continuously in the sky for 1,000 hours, pouring down unceasing heat, while the other side is in shadow. You sleep 8 hours, and when you get up and go outside, in an insulated vehicle or an extreme environment suit, you find that the shadows have moved only an inch or so, and it's that much hotter. Finally, the sun crawls down to the horizon and hangs there for a few days, periods of 24 GS hours, and then slides slowly out of sight. Then for about 100 hours there is a beautiful, unfading sunset, and it's really pleasant outdoors. Then it gets darker and colder, until, just before sunrise, it gets almost cold enough to freeze CO2. Then the sun comes up, and we begin all over again. You are picking up the impression, I trust, that, as planets go, Fenris is nobody's bargain. It isn't a real hell planet, and spacemen haven't made a swear word out of its name, as they have with the name of fluorine atmosphere Niflheim, but even the Reverend Hiram Zilker, the orthodox Monophysite preacher, admits that it's one of those planets the Creator must have gotten a trifle absent-minded with. The chartered company that colonized it, back at the end of the 4th century AE, went bankrupt in 10 years, and it wouldn't have taken that long if communication between Terra and Fenris hadn't been a matter of 6 months each way. When the smash finally came, 250,000 colonists were left stranded. They lost everything they put into the company, which for the most of them was all they had. Not a few lost their lives before the Federation Space Navy could get ships here to evacuate them. For about 1,000, who were too poor to make a fresh start elsewhere, and too tough for Fenris to kill, refused evacuation, took over all the equipment and installation the Fenris company had abandoned, and tried to make a living out of the planet. At least, they stayed alive. There are now 20-odd thousand of us, and while we are still very poor, we are very tough, and we brag about it. There were about 2,000 people, 10% of the planetary population, on the wide concrete promenade around the spaceport landing pit. I came out among them and set down the hamper with my telecast cameras and recorders, wishing, as usual, that I would find some 10 or 12-year-old kid weak-minded enough to want to be a reporter when he grew up, so that I could have an apprentice to help me with my junk. As the star, and only, reporter of the greatest, and only, paper on the planet, I was always on hand when either of the two ships on the Terra Odin milk run, the Peenemünde and the Cape Canaveral, landed. Of course, we always talk to them by screen as soon as they come out of hyperspace and into radio range, and get the passenger list and a speed recording of any news they are carrying, from the latest native uprising on Thor to the latest political scandal on Venus. Sometime the natives of Thor won't be fighting anybody at all, or the Federation member Republic of Venus will have some non-scandalous politics, and either will be the man bites dog story to end man bites dog stories. All the news is at least 6 months old, some more than a year. A spaceship can log a light year in 60-odd hours, but radio waves still crawl along at the same old 186,000 miles per second. I still have to meet the ships. There's always something that has to be picked up personally, usually an interview with some VIP traveling through. This time, though, the big story coming in on the Peenemünde was a local item. Paradox? Dad says there's no such thing. He says a paradox is either a verbal contradiction, and you get rid of it by restating it correctly, or it's a structural contradiction, and you just call it an impossibility and let it go at that. In this case, what was coming in was a real live author, who was going to write a travel book about Fenris, the planet with the 4-day year. Glenn Morrell, which sounded suspiciously like a nom de plume, and nobody here had ever heard of him. That was odd, too. One thing we can really be proud of here, besides the toughness of our citizens, is our public library. When people have to stay underground most of the time to avoid being fried and or frozen to death, they have a lot of time to kill, and reading is one of the cheaper and more harmless and profitable ways of doing it. And travel books are a special favorite here. I suppose because everybody's hoping to read about a worse place than Fenris. I had checked on Glenn Morrell at the library. None of the librarians had ever heard of him, and there wasn't a single mention of him in any of the big catalogs of publications. The first and obvious conclusion would be that Mr. Glenn Morrell was some swindler posing as an author. The only objection to that was that I couldn't quite see why any swindler would come to Fenris, or what he'd expect to swindle the Fenrisians out of. Of course, he could be on the lam from somewhere, but in that case, why bother with all the cover story? Some of our better-known citizens came here dodging warrants on other planets. I was still wondering about Morrell when somebody behind me greeted me, and I turned around. It was Tom Kuyvelson. Tom and I are buddies, when he's in port. He's just a shade older than I am. He was 18 around noon, and my 18th birthday won't come till midnight, Fenris Standard Sundial time. His father is Joe Kuyvelson, the skipper of the Javelin. Tom is sort of junior engineer, second gunner, and about third harpooner. We went to school together, which is to say, a couple of years at Professor Hartzenbosch's, learning to read and write and put figures together. That is all the schooling anybody on Fenris gets, although Joe Kuyvelson sent Tom's older sister Linda to school on Terra. Anybody who stays here has to dig out education for himself. Tom and I were still digging for ours. Each of us envied the other, when we weren't thinking seriously about it. I imagined that sea monster hunting was wonderfully thrilling and romantic, and Tom had the idea that being a newsman was real hot stuff. When we actually stopped to think about it, though, we realized that neither of us would trade jobs and take anything at all for boot. Tom couldn't string 3 sentences, no, 1 sentence, together to save his life, and I'm just a town boy who likes to live in something that isn't pitching end for end every minute. Tom is about 3 inches taller than I am, and about 30 pounds heavier. Like all monster hunters, he's trying to grow a beard, though at present it's just a blonde chin fuzz. I was surprised to see him dressed as I was, in shorts and sandals and a white shirt and a light jacket. Ordinarily, even in town, he wears boat clothes. I looked around behind him and saw the brass tip of a scabbard under the jacket. Any time a hunter-ship man doesn't have his knife on, he isn't wearing anything else. I wondered about his being in port now. I knew Joe Kyvelson wouldn't bring his ship in just to meet the Paynaminda, with only a couple of 100 hours hunting left till the storms and the cold. "I thought you were down in the South Ocean," I said. "There's going to be a special meeting of the co-op," he said. "We only heard about it last evening," by which he meant after 1800 of the previous Galactic Standard Day. He named another hunter ship captain who had called the Javelin by screen. "We screened everybody else we could." That was the way they ran things in the Hunters Cooperative. Steve Ravik would wait till everybody had their ships down on the coast of Herman Reuch's land, and then he would call a meeting and pack it with his stooges and hooligans, and get anything he wanted voted through. I had always wondered how long the real hunters were going to stand for that. They'd been standing for it ever since I could remember anything outside my own playpen, which, of course, hadn't been too long. I was about to say something to that effect, and then somebody yelled, "There she is!" I took a quick look at the radar bulbs to see which way they were pointed, and followed them up into the sky, and caught a tiny twinkle through a cloud rift. After a moment's mental arithmetic to figure out how high she'd have to be to catch the sunlight, I relaxed. Even with the telephoto, I'd only get a picture the size of a pinhead, so I fixed the position in my mind and then looked around at the crowd. Among them were 2 men, both well-dressed. One was tall and slender, with small hands and feet. The other was short and stout, with a scrubby gray-brown mustache. The slender one had a bulge under his left arm, and the short and stout job bulged over the right hip. The former was Steve Ravik, the boss of the Hunters Cooperative, and his companion was the Honorable Morton Hallstock, mayor of Port Sandor, and consequently the planetary government of Fenris. They had held their respective positions for as long as I could remember anything at all. I could never remember an election in Port Sandor, or an election of officers in the co-op. Ravik had a bunch of goons and triggermen, I could see a couple of them loitering in the background, who kept down opposition for him. So did Hallstock, only his wore badges and called themselves police. Once in a while, Dad would write a blistering editorial about one or the other, or both of them. Whenever he did, I would put my gun on, and so would Julio Kubanoff, the one-legged compositor who is the 3rd member of the Time staff, and we would take turns making sure nobody got behind Dad's back. Nothing ever happened, though, and that always rather hurt me. Those 2 racketeers were in so tight they didn't need to care what the Times printed or cast about them. Hallstock glanced over in my direction and said something to Ravik. Ravik gave a sneering laugh, and then he crushed out the cigarette he was smoking in the palm of his left hand. That was a regular trick of his, showing how tough he was. Dad says that when you see somebody showing off, Ask yourself whether he's trying to impress other people or himself. I wondered which was the case with Steve Ravik. Then I looked up again. The Peeneminda was coming down as fast as she could without overheating from atmosphere friction. She was almost buckshot-sized to the naked eye, and a couple of tugs were getting ready to go up and meet her. I got the telephoto camera out of the hamper, checked it, and aimed it. It has a shoulder stock and hand grips and a trigger like a submachine gun. I caught the ship in the finder and squeezed the trigger for a couple of seconds. It would be about 5 minutes till the tugs got to her and anything else happened, so I put down the camera and looked around. Coming through the crowd, walking as though the concrete under him was pitching and rolling like a ship's deck on contragravity in a storm, was Bish Ware. He caught sight of us, waved, overbalanced himself and recovered, and then changed course to starboard and bore down on us. He was carrying about his usual cargo, and as usual the manifest would read, "Balder Honey Rum from Harry Wong's bar." Bish wasn't his real name. Neither, I suspected, was Ware. When he'd first landed on Fenris, some 5 years ago, somebody had nicknamed him the Bishop, and before long that had gotten cut to one syllable. He looked like a bishop, or at least like what anybody who's never seen a bishop outside a screenplay would think a bishop looked like. He was a big man, not fat, but tall and portly. He had a ruddy face that always wore an expression of benevolent wisdom, and the more cargo he took on, the wiser and more benevolent he looked. He had iron-gray hair, but he wasn't old. You could tell that by the backs of his hands. They weren't wrinkled or crepey, and the veins didn't protrude. And, drunk or sober, though I never remembered seeing him in the latter condition, he had the fastest reflexes of anybody I knew. I saw him once, standing at the bar in Harry Wong's, knock over an open bottle with his left elbow. He spun half around, grabbed it by the neck, and set it up, all in one motion, without spilling a drop, and he went on talking as though nothing had happened. He was quoting Homer, I remembered, and you could tell that he was thinking in the original ancient Greek, and translating into lingua terra as he went. He was always dressed as he was now, in a conservative black suit, the jacket a trifle longer than usual, and a black neckcloth with an Uller organic opal pin. He didn't work at anything, but quarterly, once every planetary day, a draft on the banking cartel would come in for him, and he'd deposit it with the Port Sandor Fidelity and Trust. If anybody was unmannerly enough to ask him about it, he always said he had a rich uncle on Terra. When I was a kid, well, more of a kid than I am now, I used to believe he really was a bishop. Unfrocked, of course, or ungaitered, or whatever they call it when they give a bishop the heave-ho. A lot of people who weren't kids still believed that, and they blamed him on every denomination from Anglicans to Zen Buddhists, not even missing the Satanists, and there were all sorts of theories about what he'd done to get excommunicated, the mildest of which was that somewhere there was a cathedral standing unfinished because he'd hypered out with the building fund. It was generally agreed that his ecclesiastical organization was paying him to stay out there in the boondocks, where he wouldn't cause them further embarrassment. I was pretty sure myself that he was being paid by somebody, probably his family, to stay out of sight. The colonial planets are full of that sort of remittance men. Bish and I were pretty good friends. There were certain old ladies, of both sexes and all ages, of whom Professor Hartzenbosch was an example, who took Dad to task occasionally for letting me associate with him. Dad simply ignored them. As long as I was going to be a reporter, I'd have to have news sources, and Bish was a dandy. He knew all the disreputable characters in town, which saved me having to associate with all of them, and it is sad but true that you get very few news stories in Sunday school. Far from fearing that Bish would be a bad influence on me, he'd rather hoped I'd be a good one on Bish. I had that in mind, too, if I could think of any way of managing it. Bish had been a good man once. He still was, except for one thing. You could tell that, before he'd started drinking, he'd really been somebody somewhere. Then something bad must have happened to him, and now he was here on Fenris, trying to hide from it behind a bottle. Something ought to be done to give him a shove up on his feet again. I hate waste, and a man of the sort he must have been, turning himself into the rum-pot he was now, was a waste of the worst kind. It would take a lot of doing, though, and careful, tactical planning. Preaching at him would be worse than useless, so would simply trying to get him to stop drinking. And that would be what Doc Rojansky at the hospital would call treating the symptoms. The thing to do was make him want to stop drinking, and I didn't know how I was going to manage that. I'd thought, a couple of times, of getting him to work on the Times, but we barely made enough money out of it for ourselves, and with his remittance he didn't need to work. I had a lot of other ideas now and then, but every time I took a second look at one, it got sick and died. Chapter 2. Reporter Working. Bish came over and greeted us solemnly. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Captain Ahab, I believe," he said, bowing to Tom, who seemed slightly puzzled. The education Tom had been digging out for himself was technical rather than literary. "And Mr. Pulitzer, or is it Horace Greeley?" "Lord Beaverbrook, Your Grace," I replied. "Have you any little news items for us from your diocese?" Bish teetered slightly, getting out a cigar and inspecting it carefully before lighting it. "Well," he said carefully, "my diocese is full to the hatch covers with sinners, but that's scarcely news." He turned to Tom. "One of your hands on the javelin got into a fight in Martian Joe's a while ago. Lumped the other man up pretty badly." He named the javelin crewman and the man who had been pounded. The latter was one of Steve Ravick's goons. "But not fatally, I regret to say," Bish added. "The local Gestapo are looking for your man, but he made it aboard Nip Spazzoni's bulldog, and by this time he's halfway to Herman Roich's land." "Isn't Nip going to the meeting tonight?" Tom asked. Bish shook his head. "Nip is a peace-loving man. He has a well-founded suspicion that peace is going to be in short supply around Hunter's Hall this evening. You know, of course, that Leo Belcher's coming in on the Peenemünde and will be there to announce another price cut. The new price, I understand, will be 35 centisols a pound." 700 sols a ton, I thought. Why, that would barely pay ship expenses. "Where did you get that?" Tom asked, a trifle sharply. "Oh, I have my spies and informers," Bish said. "And even if I hadn't, it would figure. The only reason Leo Belcher ever comes to this Eden among planets is to negotiate a new contract, and who ever heard of a new contract at a higher price?" That had all happened before, a number of times. When Steve Ravick had gotten control of the Hunters Cooperative, the price of tallow wax on the loading floor at Port Sandor Spaceport had been 1,500 sols a ton. As far as Dad and I could find out, it was still bringing the same price on Terra as it always had. It looked to us as if Ravick and Leo Belcher, who was the co-op representative on Terra, and Mort Hallstock were simply pocketing the difference. I was just as sore about what was happening as anybody who went out in the Hunter ships. Tallow wax is our only export. All our imports are paid for with credit from the sale of wax. It isn't really wax, and it isn't tallow. It's a growth on the Jarvis's sea monster. There's a layer of it under the skin and around organs that need padding. An average-sized monster, say 150 feet long, will yield 12 to 15 tons of it, and a good hunter kills about 10 monsters a year. Well, at the price Belcher and Ravik were going to cut from, that would run a little short of 150,000 sols for a year. If you say it quick enough, and don't think, that sounds like big money. But the upkeep and supplies for a hunter ship are big money too, and what's left over after that's paid off is divided, on a graduated scale, among 10 to 15 men, from the captain down. A hunter boat captain, even a good one like Joe Kyvelson, won't make more in a year than Dad and I make out of the Times. Chemically, tallow wax isn't like anything else in the known galaxy. The molecules are huge. They can be seen with an ordinary optical microscope, and a microscopically visible molecule is a curious-looking object, to say the least. They use the stuff to treat fabric for protective garments. It isn't anything like collapsium, of course, but a suit of waxed coveralls weighing only a couple of pounds will stop as much radiation as half an inch of lead. Back when they were getting 1,500 a ton, the hunters had been making good money, but that was before Steve Ravik's time. It was slightly before mine, too. Steve Ravik had showed up on Fenris about 12 years ago. He'd had some money, and he'd bought shares in a couple of hunter ships and staked a few captains who had had bad luck and got them in debt to him. He also got in with Morton Hallstock, who controlled what some people were credulous enough to take for a government here. Before long, he was secretary of the Hunters' Cooperative. Old Simon McGregor, who had been president then, was a good hunter, but he was no businessman. He came to depend very heavily on Ravik, up till his ship, the Claymore, was lost with all hands down in Fitzwilliam Straits. I think that was a time bomb in the magazine, but I have a low and suspicious mind. Professor Hartzenbosch has told me so repeatedly. After that, Steve Ravik was president of the co-op. He immediately began a drive to increase the membership. Most of the new members had never been out in a hunter ship in their lives, but they could all be depended on to vote the way he wanted them to. First, he jacked the price of wax up, which made everybody but the wax buyers happy. Everybody who wasn't already in the co-op hurried up and joined. Then he negotiated an exclusive contract with Kapstad Chemical Products Limited in South Africa, by which they agreed to take the entire output for the co-op. That ended competitive wax buying, and when there was nobody to buy the wax but Kapstad, you had to sell it through the cooperative, or you didn't sell it at all. After that, the price started going down. The cooperative, for which Red Steve Ravik, had a sales representative on Terra, Leo Belcher. He wrote all the contracts, collected all the money, and split with Ravik. What was going on was pretty generally understood, even if it couldn't be proven. But what could anybody do about it? Maybe somebody would try to do something about it at the meeting this evening. I would be there to cover it. I was beginning to wish I owned a bulletproof vest. Bish and Tom were exchanging views on the subject, some of them almost printable. I had my eyes to my binoculars, watching the tugs go up to meet the Paynaminda. "What we need for Ravik, Hallstock, and Belcher," Tom was saying, "is about 4 fathoms of harpoon line apiece, and something to haul up to." That kind of talk would have shocked Dad. He is very strong for law and order, even when there is no order and the law itself is illegal. I'd always thought there was a lot of merit in what Tom was suggesting. Bish Ware seemed to have his doubts, though. No, there ought to be some better way of doing it than that." "Can you think of one?" Tom challenged. I didn't hear Bish's reply. By that time, the tugs were almost to the ship. I grabbed up the telephoto camera and aimed it. It has its own power unit and transmits directly. In theory, I could tune it to the telecast station and put what I was getting right on the air, and what I was doing was transmitting to the Times, to be recorded and cast later. Because it's not 100% reliable, though, it makes its own audio-visual record, so if any of what I was sending didn't get through, it could be spliced in after I got back. I got some footage of the tugs grappling the ship, which was now completely weightless, and pulling her down. Through the finder, I could see that she had her landing legs extended. She looked like a big, overfed spider being hauled in by a couple of gnats. I kept the butt of the camera to my shoulder, and whenever anything interesting happened, I'd squeeze the trigger. The first time I ever used a real submachine gun had been to kill a blue slasher that had gotten into one of the ship pools at the waterfront. I used 3 one-second bursts, and threw bits of slasher all over the place, and everybody wondered how I'd gotten the practice. A couple more boats, pushers, went up to help hold the ship against the wind, and by that time she was down to 1,000 feet, which was half her diameter. I switched from the shoulder-stock telephoto to the big tripod job, because this was the best part of it. The ship was weightless, of course, but she had mass, and an awful lot of it. If anybody goofed getting her down, she'd take the side of the landing pit out, and about 10% of the population of Fenris, including the ace reporter for the Times, along with it. At the same time, some workmen and a couple of spaceport cops had appeared, taken out a section of railing and put in a gate. The Peenemünde settled down, turned slowly to get her port in line with the gate, and lurched off contragravity and began running out a bridge to the promenade. I got some shots of that, and then began packing my stuff back in the hamper. "You going aboard?" Tom asked. "Can I come along? I can carry some of your stuff and let on I'm your helper." Glory be, I thought. I finally got that apprentice. "Why, sure," I said. "You tow the hamper. I'll carry this." I got out what looked like a big camera case and slung it over my shoulder. "But you'll have to take me out on the Javelin sometime and let me shoot a monster." He said it was a deal, and we shook on it. Then I had another idea. "Bish, suppose you come with us too," I said. "After all, Tom and I are just a couple of kids, and if you're with us, it'll look a lot more big paperish." That didn't seem to please Tom too much. Bish shook his head, though, and Tom brightened. "I'm dreadfully sorry, Walt," Bish said, "but I'm going aboard myself to see a friend who is en route through to Odin, a Dr. Watson. I haven't seen him for years." I'd caught that name, too, when we got in the passenger list. Dr. John Watson. Now I know that all sorts of people call themselves doctor, and Watson and John aren't too improbable a combination. But I'd read Sherlock Holmes long ago, and the name had caught my attention. And this was the first, to my knowledge, that Bish Ware had ever admitted to any off-planet connections. We started over to the gate. Hallstock and Ravik were ahead of us. So was Sigurd Ngazori, the president of the Fidelity and Trust, carrying a heavy briefcase and accompanied by a character with a submachine gun, and Adolf Lottier and Professor Hartzenbosch. There were a couple of spaceport cops at the gate, in olive-green uniforms that looked as though they had been sprayed on, and steel helmets. I wished we had a city police force like that. They were Odin Dock and Shipyard Company men, all former Federation Regular Army or Colonial Constabulary. The spaceport wasn't part of Port Sandor, or even Fenris. The Odin Dock and Shipyard Company was the government there, and it was run honestly and efficiently. They knew me, and when they saw Tom towing my hamper, they cracked a few jokes about the new Times cub reporter and waved us through. I thought they might give Bish an argument, but they just nodded and let him pass too. We all went out onto the bridge and across the pit to the equator of the 2,000-foot globular ship. We went into the main lounge, and the captain introduced us to Mr. Glenn Morrell. He was fairly tall, with light gray hair, prematurely so, I thought, and a pleasant, non-committal face. I'd have pegged him for a businessman. Well, I suppose authoring is a business, if that was his business. He shook hands with us and said, "Aren't you rather young to be a newsman?" I started to burn on that. I get it all the time, and it burns me all the time, but worst of all, on the job. Maybe I am only going on 18, but I'm doing a man's work, and I'm doing it competently. "Well, they grow up young on Fenris, Mr. Morell." Captain Marshak earned my gratitude by putting in, "Either that, or they don't live to grow up." Morell unhooked his memophone and repeated the captain's remark into it. Opening line for one of his chapters. Then he wanted to know if I'd been born on Fenris. I saw I was going to have to get firm with Mr. Morell right away. The time to stop that sort of thing is as soon as it starts. Who, I wanted to know, is interviewing whom? You'll have at least 500 hours till the next possible ship out of here. I only have 2.5 to my next deadline. You want coverage, don't you? The more publicity you get, the easier your own job's going to be. Then I introduced Tom, carefully giving the impression that while I handled all ordinary assignments, I needed help to give him the full VIP treatment. We went over to a quiet corner and sat down, and the interview started. The camera case I was carrying was a snare and a deceit. Everybody knows that reporters use recorders in interviews, but it never pays to be too obtrusive about them, or the subject gets recorder conscious and stiffens up. What I had was better than a recorder. It was a recording radio. Like the audiovisuals, it not only transmitted into the times, but made a recording as insurance against transmission failure. I reached into a slit on the side and snapped on the switch while I was fumbling with a pencil and notebook with the other hand, and started by asking him what had decided him to do a book about Fenris. After that, I fed a question every now and then to keep him running, and only listened to every third word. The radio was doing a better job than I possibly could have. At the same time, I was watching Steve Ravik, Morton Hallstock, and Leo Belcher at one side of the room, and Bish Ware at the other. Bish was within ear-straining range. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another man, younger in appearance and looking like an army officer in civvies, approach him. "My dear Bishop," this man said in greeting. As far as I knew, that nickname had originated on Fenris. I made a mental note of that. "How are you?" Bish replied, grasping the other man's hand. "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." That did it. I told you I was an old Sherlock Holmes reader. I recognized that line. This meeting was prearranged. Neither of them had ever met before, and they needed a recognition code. Then I returned to Morell, and decided to wonder about Bish Ware and Dr. Watson later. It wasn't long before I was noticing a few odd things about Morell, too, which confirmed my original suspicions of him. He didn't have the firm name of his alleged publishers right. He didn't know what a literary agent was, and, after claiming to have been a newsman, he consistently used the expression news service. I know everybody says that. Everybody but newsmen. They always call a news service a paper, especially when talking to other newsmen. Of course, there isn't any paper connected with it except the pad the editor doodles on. What gets to the public is photoprint, out of a teleprinter. As small as our circulation is, we have 400 or 500 of them in Port Sandor and around among the small settlements in the archipelago, and even on the mainland. Most of them are in bars and cafes and cigar stores and places like that, operated by a coin in a slot and leased by the proprietor, and some of the big hunter ships like Joe Kivelson's Javelin and Nip Spazzoni's Bulldog have them. But long ago, back in the first centuries, pre-atomic and atomic era, they were actually printed on paper, and the copies distributed and sold. They used printing presses as heavy as a spaceship's engines. That's why we still call ourselves the press. Some of the old papers on Terra, like the Prensa in Buenos Aires and the Melbourne Times, which used to be the London Times when there was still a London, were printed that way originally. Finally, I got through with my interview and then shot about 15 minutes of audiovisual, which would be cut to 5 for the cast. By this time, Bish and Dr. Watson had disappeared, I suppose to the ship's bar, and Ravik and his accomplices had gotten through with their conspiracy to defraud the hunters. I turned Morell over to Tom and went over to where they were standing together. I'd put away my pencil and pad long ago with Morell. Now I got them out ostentatiously as I approached. "Good day, gentlemen," I greeted them. "I'm representing the Port Sandor Times." "Oh, run along, Sonny. We haven't time to bother with you," Hallstock said. "But I want to get a story from Mr. Belcher," I began. "Well, come back in 5 or 6 years, when you're dry behind the ears, and you can get it," Ravik told me. "Our readers aren't interested in the condition of my ears," I said sweetly. "They want to read about the price of tallow wax. What's this about another price cut? To 35 centisols a pound, I understand?" "Oh, Steve, the young man's from the news service, and his father will publish whatever he brings home," Belcher argued. "We'd better give him something." He turned to me. "I don't know how this got out, but it's quite true," he said. He had a long face, like a horse's. At least, he looked like pictures of horses I'd seen. As he spoke, he pulled it even longer and became as doleful as an undertaker at a 10,000-soul funeral. "The price has gone down again. Somebody has developed a synthetic substitute. Of course, it isn't anywhere near as good as real Fenris tallow wax, but try and tell the public that. So, Capstad Chemical's being undersold, and the only way they can stay in business is cut the price they have to pay for wax." It went on like that, and this time I had real trouble keeping my anger down. In the first place, I was pretty sure there was no substitute for Fenris tallow wax, good, bad, or indifferent. In the second place, it isn't sold to the gullible public. It's sold to equipment manufacturers who have their own test engineers and who have to keep their products up to legal safety standards. He didn't know this balderdash of his was going straight to the Times as fast as he spouted it. He thought I was taking it down in shorthand. I knew exactly what Dad would do with it. He'd put it on telecast in Belcher's own voice. Maybe the monster hunters would start looking around for a rope then. When I got through listening to him, I went over and got a short audiovisual of Captain Marshak of the Peenemünde for the cast, and then I rejoined Tom and Morell. "Mr. Morell says he's staying with you at the Times," Tom said. He seemed almost as disappointed as Professor Hartzenbosch. I wondered, for an incredulous moment, if Tom had been trying to kidnap Morell away from me. "He wants to go out on the Javelin with us for a monster hunt." "Well, that's swell," I said. "You can pay off on that promise to take me monster hunting, too. Right now, Mr. Morell is my big story." I reached into the front pocket of my camera case for the handphone to shift to two-way. "I'll call the Times and have somebody come up with a car to get us and Mr. Morell's luggage." "Oh, I have a car. Jeep, that is," Tom said. "It's down on the bottom level. We can use that." Funny place to leave a car. And I was sure that he and Morell had come to some kind of an understanding while I was being lied to by Belcher. I didn't get it. There was just too much going on around me that I didn't get. And me, I'm supposed to be the razor-sharp news hawk who gets everything. Chapter 3. Bottom Level. It didn't take long to get Morell's luggage assembled. There was surprisingly little of it, and nothing that looked like photographic or recording equipment. When he returned from a final gathering up in his stateroom, I noticed that he was bulging under his jacket, too, on the left side at the waist. About enough for an 8.5mm pocket automatic. Evidently, he had been briefed on the law and order situation in Port Sandor. Normally, we'd have gone off onto the main city level, but Tom's jeep was down on the bottom level, and he made no suggestion that we go off and wait for him to bring it up. I didn't suggest it either. After all, it was his jeep, and he wasn't our hired pilot. Besides, I was beginning to get curious. An abnormally large bump of curiosity is part of every newsman's basic equipment. We borrowed a small handling lifter and one of the spaceport roustabouts to tow it for us, loaded Morell's luggage and my things onto it, and started down to the bottom side cargo hatches, from which the ship was discharging. There was no cargo at all to go aboard, except mail and things like Adolphe Latier's old film and music tapes. Our only export is tallow wax, and it all goes to Terra. It would be picked up by the Cape Canaveral when she got in from Odin 500 hours from now. But except for a few luxury items from Odin, everything we import comes from Terra, and the Peenemünde had started discharging that already. We rode down on a contragravity skid loaded with ammunition. I saw Morell looking curiously at the square cases, marked Terran Federation Armed Forces, and 50mm Mark 608 anti-vehicle and anti-personnel, 25 rounds, and overage, practice only, not to be issued for service, and inspected and condemned. The hunters bought that stuff through the co-op. It cost half as much as new ammo, but that didn't help them any. The difference stopped with Steve Ravik. Morell didn't comment, and neither did Tom or I. We got off at the bottom of the pit, 1,000 feet below the promenade from which I had come aboard, and stopped for a moment. Morell was looking about the great amphitheater in amazement. "I knew this spaceport would be big when I found out that the ship landed directly on the planet," he said, "but I never expected anything like this. And this serves a population of 20,000? 24,708, if the man who got pounded in a barroom fight around 1330 hasn't died yet," I said. "But you have to remember that this place was built close to 100 years ago, when the population was 10 times that much." I'd gotten my story from him. Now it was his turn to interview me. "You know something about the history of Fenris, I suppose?" "Yes. There are ample sources for it on Terra, up to the collapse of the Fenris Company," he said. "Too much isn't known about what's been happening here since, which is why I decided to do this book." "Well, there were several cities built, over on the mainland," I told him. "They're all abandoned now. The first one was a conventional city, the buildings all on the surface. After one day and night cycle, they found that it was uninhabitable. It was left unfinished. Then they started digging in. The chartered Fenris Company shipped in huge quantities of mining and earth-moving equipment. That put the company in the red more than anything else, and they began making burrow cities, like the ones built in the northern hemisphere of Terra during the Third and Fourth World Wars, or like the cities on Luna and Mercury Twilight Zone on Titan. There are a lot of valuable mineral deposits over on the mainland. Maybe in another century, our grandchildren will start working them again. But about 6 years before the Fenris Company went to pieces, they decided to concentrate in one city, here in the archipelago. The seawater stays cooler in the daytime and doesn't lose heat so rapidly in the nighttime. So they built Port Sandor, here on Oakleaf Island. "And for convenience in monster hunting?" I shook my head. "No, the Jarvis's sea monster wasn't discovered until after the city was built, and it was years after the company had gone bankrupt before anybody found out about what tallow wax was good for. I started telling him about the native life forms of Fenris. Because of the surface temperature extremes, the marine life is the most highly developed. The land animals are active during the periods after sunset and after sunrise. When it begins getting colder or hotter, they burrow or crawl into caves and crevices among the rocks, and go into suspended animation. I found that he'd read up on that, and not too much of his information was incorrect. He seemed to think, though, that Port Sandor had also been mined out below the surface. I set him right on that. "You saw what it looked like when you were coming down," I said. "Just a flat plateau, with a few shaft-head domes here and there, and the landing pit of the spaceport. Well, originally it was a valley, between two low hills. The city was built in the valley, level by level, and then the tops of the hills were dug off and bulldozed down on top of it. We have a lot of film at the public library of the construction of the city, step by step. As far as I know, there are no copies anywhere off-planet." He should have gotten excited about that and wanted to see them. Instead, he was watching the cargo come off, foodstuffs now, and wanted to know if we had to import everything we needed. "Oh no, we're going in on the bottom level, which is mainly storage, but we have hydroponic farms for our vegetables and carniculture plants for meat on the second and third levels. That's counting down from the main city level. We make our own lumber out of reeds harvested in the swamps after sunrise and converted to pulpwood, and we get some good hardwood from the native trees, which only grow in 4 periods of 200 hours a year. We only use that for furniture, gun stocks, that sort of thing. And there are a couple of mining camps and smelters on the mainland. They employ about 1,000 of our people. But every millisol that's spent on this planet is gotten from the sale of tallow wax, at second or third hand, if not directly." That seemed to interest him more. Maybe his book, if he was really writing one, was going to be an economic study of Fenris. Or maybe his racket, whatever it was, would be based on something connected with our local production. I went on telling him about our hydroponic farms and the carniculture plant where any kind of animal tissue we want is grown. Terran pork and beef and poultry, Freyan zoomy meat, Zarathustran veldbeest. He knew already that none of the native life forms, animal or vegetable, were edible by Terrans. "You can get all the pâté de foie gras you want here," I said. "We have a chunk of goose liver about 50 feet in diameter growing in one of our vats." By this time, we'd gotten across the bottom of the pit, Morell's luggage and my equipment being towed after us, and had entered the bottom level. It was cool and pleasant here, lighted from the ceiling 50 feet overhead, among the great column bases, 200 feet square and 200 yards apart, that supported the upper city and the thick roof of rock and earth that insulated it. The area we were entering was stacked with tallow wax, waiting to be loaded onto the Cape Canaveral when she came in. It was vacuum-packed in plastic skins, like big half-ton bologna sausages, each one painted with the blue and white emblem of the Hunters Cooperative. He was quite interested in that, and was figuring, mentally, how much wax there was here and how much it was worth. "Who does this belong to?" he wanted to know. "The Hunters Cooperative?" Tom had been letting me do the talking up to now, but he answered that question very emphatically. "No, it doesn't. It belongs to the Hunters," he said. "Each ship crew owns the wax they bring in common, and it's sold for them by the co-op. When the captain gets paid for the wax he's turned over to the co-op, he divides the money among the crew. But every scrap of this belongs to the ships that took it in, up till it's bought and paid for by Capstad Chemical." "Well, if a captain wants his wax back, after it's been turned over for sale to the co-op, can he get it?" Morell asked. "Absolutely." Morell nodded, and we went on. The roustabout who had been following us with the lifter had stopped to chat with a couple of his fellows. We went on slowly, and now and then a vehicle, usually a lorry, would pass above us. Then I saw Bish Ware ahead, sitting on a sausage of wax, talking to one of the spaceport police. They were both smoking, but that was all right. Tallow wax will burn, and a wax fire is something to get really excited about, but the ignition point is 750 degrees centigrade, and that's a lot hotter than the end of anybody's cigar. He must have come out the same way we did, and I added that to the Wonder Why file. Pretty soon, I'd have so many questions to wonder about that they'd start answering each other. He saw us and waved to us, and then suddenly the spaceport cop's face got as white as my shirt, and he grabbed Bish by the arm. Bish didn't change color. He just shook off the cop's hand, got to his feet, dropped his cigar, and took a side-skip out into the aisle. "Morrell!" he yelled. "Freeze! On your life, don't move a muscle!" Then there was a gun going off in his hand. I didn't see him reach for it, or where he drew it from. It was just in his hand, firing, and the empty brass flew up and came down on the concrete with a jingle on the heels of the report. We had all stopped short, and the roustabout who was towing the lifter came hurrying up. Morrell simply stood gaping at Bish. "All right," Bish said, slipping his gun back into a shoulder holster under his coat. "Step carefully to your left. Don't move right at all." Morrell, still in a sort of trance, obeyed. As he did, I looked past his right shin and saw what Bish had been shooting at. It was an irregular gray oval, about 16 inches by 4 at its widest, and tapering up in front to a cone about 6 inches high, into which a rod-like member, darker gray, was slowly collapsing and dribbling oily yellow stuff. The bullet had gone clear through and made a mess of dirty gray and black and green body fluids on the concrete. It was what we call a tread snail, because it moves on a double row of pads like stumpy feet and leaves a trail like a tractor. The fish-pole aerial thing it had erected out of its head was its stinger, and the yellow stuff was venom. 1/10 of a milligram of it in your blood, and it's, "Get the gate open, St. Peter, here I come." Tom saw it as soon as I did. His face got the same color as the cop's. I don't suppose mine looked any better. When Morrell saw what had been buddying up to him, I will swear, on a warehouse full of Bibles, Korans, Torah scrolls, Satanist grimoires, Buddhist prayer wheels, and Thorin grandfather god images, that his hair literally stood on end. I've heard that expression all my life. Well, this time I really saw it happen. I mentioned that he seemed to have been reading up on the local fauna. I looked down at his right leg. He hadn't been stung. If he had, he wouldn't be breathing now. But he had been squirted, and there were a couple of yellow stains on the cloth of his trouser leg. I told him to hold still, used my left hand to pull the cloth away from his leg, and got out my knife and flipped it open with the other hand, cutting away the poisoned cloth and dropping it on the dead snail. Morrell started making an outcry about cutting up his trousers, and said he could have had them cleaned. Bish Ware, coming up, told him to stop talking like an imbecile. No cleaner would touch them, and even if they were cleaned, some of the poison would remain in the fabric. Then, the next time you were caught in the rain with a scratch on your leg, Walt here would write you one of his very nicest obituaries. Then he turned to the cop, who was gabbling into his belt radio, and said, "Get an ambulance, quick. Possible case of tread snail skin poisoning." A moment later, looking at Morrell's leg, he added, "Omit possible." There were a couple of little spots on Morrell's skin that were beginning to turn raw liver color. The raw poison hadn't gotten into his blood, but some of it, with impurities, had filtered through the cloth, and he'd absorbed enough of it through his skin to make him seriously ill. The cop jabbered some more into the radio, and the laborer with the lifter brought it and let it down, and Morrell sat down on his luggage. Tom lit a cigarette and gave it to him, and told him to remain perfectly still. In a couple of minutes, an ambulance was coming, its siren howling. The pilot and his helper were both jackleg medics, at least as far as first aid. They gave him a drink out of a flask, smeared a lot of gunk on the spots, and slapped plasters over them, and helped him into the ambulance, after I told him we'd take his things to the Times building. By this time, between the shot and the siren, quite a crowd had gathered, and everybody was having a nice little recrimination party. The labor foreman was chewing the cop out, the warehouse superintendent was chewing him out, and somebody from the general superintendent's office was chewing out everybody indiscriminately, and at the same time mentioning to me that Mr. Feishi, the superintendent, would be very much pleased if the Times didn't mention the incident at all. I told him that was editorial policy, and to talk to Dad about it. Nobody had any idea how the thing had gotten in, but that wasn't much of a mystery. The bottom level is full of things like that. They can stay active all the time because the temperature is constant. I supposed that eventually they'd pick the dumbest day laborer in the place and make him the patsy. Tom stood watching the ambulance whisk Morrell off, dithering in indecision. The poisoning of Morrell seemed like an unexpected blow to him. That fitted what I'd begun to think. Finally, he motioned the laborer to pick up the lifter, and we started off toward where he had parked his jeep, outside the spaceport area. Bish walked along with us, drawing his pistol and replacing the fired round in the magazine. I noticed that it was a 10mm Colt Argentine Federation service, commercial type. There aren't many of those on Fenris. A lot of 10mm, but mostly South African Sturbergs or Vickers Botas, or Mars Consolidated Police Specials. Mine, which I wasn't carrying at the moment, was a Sturberg 7.7mm Olympic match. "You know," he said, sliding the gun back under his coat, "I would be just as well pleased as Mr. Feishi if this didn't get any publicity. If you do publish anything about it, I wish you'd minimize my own part in it. As you have noticed, I have some slight proficiency with lethal hardware. This I would prefer not to advertise. I can usually avoid trouble, but when I can't, I would like to retain the advantage of surprise." We all got into the jeep. Tom, not too graciously, offered to drop Bish wherever he was going. Bish said he was going to the Times, so Tom lifted the jeep and cut in the horizontal drive. We got into a busy one-way aisle, crowded with lorries hauling foodstuffs to the refrigeration area. He followed that for a short distance, and then turned off into a dimly lighted, disused area. Before long, I began noticing stacks of tallow wax, put up in the regular outside sausage skins, but without the co-op markings. They just had the names of hunter ships: Javelin, Bulldog, Helldiver, Slasher, and so on. "What's that stuff doing in here?" I asked. "It's a long way from the docks, and a long way from the spaceport." "Oh, just temporary storage," Tom said. "It hasn't been checked in with the co-op yet." That wasn't any answer. Or maybe it was. I let it go at that. Then we came to an open space about 50 feet square. There was a jeep, with a 7mm machine gun mounted on it, and half a dozen men in boat clothes were playing cards at a table made out of empty ammunition boxes. I noticed they were all wearing pistols, and when a couple of them saw us, they got up and grabbed rifles. Tom let down and got out of the jeep, going over and talking with them for a few minutes. What he had to tell them didn't seem to bring any noticeable amount of sunlight into their lives. After a while, he came back, climbed in at the controls, and lifted the jeep again. Chapter 4. Main City Level. The ceiling on Main City Level is 200 feet high. In order to permit free circulation of air and avoid traffic jams, nothing is built higher than 150 feet, except the square buildings, 200 yards apart, which rest on foundations on the bottom level and extend up to support the roof. The Times has one of these pillar buildings, and we have the whole thing to ourselves. In a city built for 250,000, 20,000 people don't have to crowd very closely on one another. Naturally, we don't have a top landing stage, but except for the buttresses at the corners and solid central column, the whole street floor is open. Tom hadn't said anything after we left the stacks of wax and the men guarding them. We came up a vehicle shaft a few blocks up Broadway, and he brought the Jeep down and floated it in through one of the archways. As usual, the place was cluttered with equipment we hadn't gotten around to repairing or installing, merchandise we'd taken in exchange for advertising, and vehicles, our own and everybody else's. A couple of mechanics were tinkering on one of them. I decided, for the umpteenth time, to do something about cleaning it up. Say in another 200 or 300 hours, when the ships would all be in port and work would be slack, and I could hire a couple of good men to help. We got Morell's stuff off the Jeep, and I hunted around till I found a hand lifter. "Want to stay and have dinner with us, Tom?" I asked. "Huh?" It took him a second or so to realize what I'd said. "Why, no, thanks, Walt. I have to get back to the ship. Father wants to see me before the meeting." "How about you, Bish? Want to take potluck with us?" "I shall be delighted," he assured me. Tom told us good-bye absent-mindedly, lifted the Jeep, and floated it out into the street. Bish and I watched him go. Bish looked as though he wanted to say something, and then thought better of it. We floated Morell's stuff and mine over to the elevator beside the central column, and I ran it up to the editorial offices on the top floor. We came out in a big room, half the area of the floor, full of work tables and radios and screens and photo-printing machines. Dad, as usual, was in a gray, knee-length smock, with a pipe jutting out under his ragged mustache, and, as usual, he was stopping every minute or so to relight it. He was putting together the stuff I transmitted in for the audiovisual newscast. Over across the room, the rest of the Times staff, Julio Kubanoff, was sitting at the composing machine, his peg leg propped up and an earphone on, his fingers punching rapidly at the keyboard as he burned letters onto the white plastic sheet with ultraviolet rays for photographing. Julio was an old hunter ship man who had lost a leg in an accident and taught himself his new trade. He still wore the beard, now white, that was practically the monster hunter's uniform. "The stuff come in all right?" I asked Dad, letting down the lifter. "Yes. What do you think of that fellow Belcher?" he asked. "Did you ever hear such an impudent string of lies in your life?" Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the lifter full of luggage and saw somebody with me. "Mr. Morell, please excuse me for a moment till I get this blasted thing together straight." Then he got the film spliced and the sound record matched and looked up. "Why, Bish? Where's Mr. Morell, Walt?" "Mr. Morell has had his initiation to Fenris," I said. "He got squirted by a tread snail almost as soon as he got off the ship. They have him at the spaceport hospital. It'll be 2400 before they get all the poison sweated out of him." I went on to tell him what had happened. Dad's eyes widened slightly, and he took the pipe out of his mouth and looked at Bish with something very reasonably like respect. "That was mighty sharp work," he said. "If you'd been a second slower, we'd be all out of visiting authors. That would have been a nice business. Story would have gotten back to Terra and been most unfortunate publicity for Fenris. And, of course," he afterthoughted, "most unfortunate for Mr. Morell, too." "Well, if you'll give this any publicity, I would rather you passed my own trifling exploit over in silence," Bish said.
I gather the spaceport people wouldn't be too happy about giving the public the impression that their area is teeming with tread snails either. They have enough trouble hiring shipping floor help as it is."
"But don't you want people to know what you did?" Dad demanded, incredulously. Everybody wanted their names in print or on cast. That was one of his basic articles of faith. "If the public learned about this," he went on, and then saw where he was heading and pulled up short. It wouldn't be tactful to say something like, "Maybe they wouldn't think you were just a worthless old soak." Bish saw where Dad was heading too, but he just smiled, as though he were about to confer his episcopal blessing.
But that would be a step out of character for me," he said. "I must not confuse my public. Just as a favor to me, Ralph, say nothing about it."
"Well, if you'd rather I didn't. Are you going to cover this meeting at Hunter's Hall tonight, Walt?" he asked me. "Would I miss it?" He frowned. "I could handle that myself," he said. "I'm afraid this meeting's going to get a little rough." I shook my head. "Let's face it, Dad," I said. "I'm a little short of 18, but you're 60. I can see things coming better than you can, and dodge them quicker." Dad gave a rueful little laugh and looked at Bish. "See how it goes?" he asked. "We spend our lives shielding our young, and then, all of a sudden, we find they're shielding us." His pipe had gone out again, and he relit it. "Too bad you didn't get an audio-visual of Belcher making that idiotic statement." He didn't even know I was getting a voice only. All the time he was talking, I was doodling in a pad with a pencil. "Synthetic substitutes," Dad snorted. "Putting a synthetic tallow wax molecule together would be like trying to build a spaceship with a jackknife and a tack hammer." He puffed hard on his pipe, and then excused himself and went back to his work. Editing an audio-visual telecast is pretty much a one-man job. Bish wanted to know if he could be of assistance, but there was nothing either of us could do, except sit by and watch and listen. Dad handled the Belcher thing by making a film of himself playing off the recording, and interjecting sarcastic comments from time to time. When it went on the air, I thought Ravik wasn't going to like it. I would have to start wearing my pistol again. Then he made a tape on the landing of the Peeneminda and the arrival of Morell, who, he said, had met with a slight accident after leaving the ship. I took that over to Julio when Dad was finished, along with the tape on the announced tallow wax price cut. Julio only grunted and pushed them aside. He was setting up the story of the fight in Martian Joe's, a local bar, of course. Nobody ever gets shot or stabbed or slashed or slugged in anything else. All the news is fit to print, sure, but you can't give your advertisers and teleprinter customers any worse name than they already have. A paper has to use some judgment. Then Dad and Bish and I went down to dinner. Julio would have his a little later, not because we're too good to eat with the help, but because, around 1830, the help is too busy setting up the next paper to eat with us. The dining room, which is also the library, living room, and general congregating and loafing place, is as big as the editorial room above. Originally, it was an office, at a time when a lot of Fenris Company office work was being done here. Some of the furniture is original, and some was made for us by local cabinet makers out of native hardwood. The dining table, big enough for 2 ships' crews to eat at, is an example of the latter. Then, of course, there are screens and micro-book cabinets and things like that, and a refrigerator to save going a couple of 100 feet to the pantry in case anybody wants a snack. I went to that and opened it, and got out a bulb of concentrated fruit juice and a bottle of carbonated water. Dad, who seldom drinks, keeps a few bottles around for guests. Seems most of our guests part with information easier if they have something like the locally made hydroponic potato schnapps inside them for courage.
"You drink Balder honey rum, don't you, Bish?" he said, pawing among the bottles in the liquor cabinet next to the refrigerator. "I'm sure I have a bottle of it. Now wait a minute. It's here somewhere. When Dad passes on, and some medium claims to have produced a spirit communication from him, I will not accept it as genuine without the expression, 'Now wait a minute, it's here somewhere.'" Bish wanted to know what I was fixing for myself, and I told him. "Never mind the rum, Ralph. I believe," he said, "that I shall join Walt in a fruit fizz." Well, what do you know? Maybe my stealthy temperance campaign was having results. Dad looked positively startled, and then replaced the bottle he was holding. "I believe I'll make it unanimous," he said. "Fix me up a fruit fizz too, Walt." I mixed 2 more fruit fizzes, and we carried them over to the table. Bish sipped at his critically. "Palatable," he pronounced it. "Just a trifle on the mild side, but definitely palatable." Dad looked at him as though he still couldn't believe the whole thing. Dinner was slow coming. We finished our fizzes, and Bish and I both wanted repeats, and Dad felt that he had to go along. So I made 3 more. We were finishing them when Mrs. Layden started bringing in the dinner. Mrs. Layden is a widow. She has been with us since my mother died, the year after I was born. She is violently anti-liquor. Reluctantly, she condones Dad taking a snort now and then, but as soon as she saw Bish wear, her face started to stiffen. She put the soup on the table and took off for the kitchen. She always has her own dinner with Julio. That way, while they're eating, he can tell her all the news that's fit to print, and all the gossip that isn't. For the moment, the odd things I'd been noticing about our distinguished and temporarily incapacitated visitor came under the latter head. I told Dad and Bish about my observations, beginning with the deafening silence about Glenn Morrell at the library. Dad began popping immediately. "Why, he must be an imposter!" he exclaimed. "What kind of a racket do you think he's up to?" I wouldn't say that. Not right away," Bish said. "In the first place, Morrell may be his true name, and he may publish under a nom de plume. I admit some of the other items are a little suspicious, but even if he isn't an author, he may have some legitimate business here, and having heard a few stories about this planetary Elysium, he may be exercising a little caution. Walt, tell your father about that tallow wax we saw, down in bottom level, 4th Ward." I did, and while I was talking, Dad sat with his soup spoon poised halfway to his mouth for at least a minute, before he remembered he was holding it. "Now, that is funny," he said when I was through. "Why do you suppose?" "Somebody," Bish said, "some group of ship captains, is holding wax out from the cooperative. There's no other outlet for it, so my guess is that they're holding it for a rise in price. There's only one way that could happen, and that, literally, would be over Steve Ravick's dead body. It could be that they expect Steve's dead body to be around for a price rise to come in over." I was expecting Dad to begin spouting law and order. Instead, he hit the table with his fist, not, fortunately, the one that was holding the soup spoon. "Well, I hope so. And if they do it before the Cape Canaveral gets in, they may fix Leo Belcher too. And then, in the general excitement, somebody might clobber Mort Hallstock, and that'd be grand slam. After the triple funeral, we could go to work on setting up an honest cooperative and an honest government." "Well, I never expected to hear you advocating lynch law, Dad," I said. He looked at me for a few seconds. "Tell the truth, Walt,
neither did I, he admitted. Lynch law is a horrible thing. Don't make any mistake about that. But there's one thing more horrible, and that's no law at all. And that is the present situation in Port Sandor. You know what the trouble is here? We have no government. No legal government, anyhow. No government under Federation law. We don't even have a Federation resident agent. Before the Fenris company went broke, it was the government here. When the Space Navy evacuated the colonists, they evacuated the government along with them. The 1,000 who remained were all too busy keeping alive to worry about that. They didn't even care when Fenris was reclassified from Class 3, uninhabited but inhabitable, to Class 2, inhabitable only in artificial environment, like Mercury or Titan. And when Mort Hallstock got hold of the town-meeting pseudo-government they put together 50 years ago and turned it into a dictatorship, nobody realized what had happened till it was too late. Lynch law is the only recourse we have.
Ralph, Bish told him, if anything like that starts, Belcher and Hallstock and Ravik won't be the only casualties. Between Ravik's goons and Hallstock's police, they have close to 100 men. I won't deny that they could be cleaned out, but it wouldn't be a lynching. It would be a civil war.
Well, that's swell, Dad said. The Federation government has never paid us any attention. The Federation planets are scattered over too many million cubic light-years of space for the government to run around to all of them wiping everybody's noses. As long as things are quiet here, they'll continue to do nothing for us. But let a story hit the big papers on Terra. Revolution breaks out on Fenris, and that'll be the story I'll send to Interworld News, and watch what happens.
I will tell you what will happen, Bishware said. A lot of people will get killed. That isn't important in itself. People are getting killed all the time, in a lot worse causes. But these people will all have friends and relatives who will take it up for them. Start killing people here in a faction fight, and somebody will be shooting somebody in the back out of a dark passage 100 years from now over it. You want this planet poisoned with blood feuds for the next century?
Dad and I looked at one another. That was something that hadn't occurred to either of us, and it should have. There were feuds, even now. Half the little settlements on the other islands and on the mainland had started when some group or family moved out of Port Sandor because of the enmity of some larger and more powerful group or family, and half our shootings and knife fights grew out of old grudges between families or hunting crews. We don't want it poisoned for the next century with the sort of thing Mort Hallstock and Steve Ravik started here either, Dad said.
Granted, Bish nodded. If a civil war is the only possible way to get rid of them, that's what you'll have to have, I suppose. Only make sure you don't leave a single one of them alive when it's over. But if you can get the Federation government in here to clean the mess up, that would be better. Nobody starts a vendetta with the Terran Federation.
But how? Dad asked. I've sent story after story off about crime and corruption on Fenris. They all get the file-and-forget treatment. Mrs. Layden had taken away the soup plates and brought us our main course. Bish sat toying with his fork for a moment.
I don't know what you can do, he said slowly. If you can stall off the blow-up till the Cape Canaveral gets in, and you can send somebody to Terra... All of a sudden, it hit me. Here was something that would give Bish a purpose, something to make him want to stay sober.
Well, don't say, if you can, I said. Say, if we can. You live on Fenris too, don't you?